In the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Saint Vincent Ferrer, St. Jude, Lady of Victory, Lady of Sorrows, Lady of Alpha Christians, St. Ignatius. So in any case, we'll continue here. I'm not going to be able to go through every detail, but talking here about the holiness of the church, and we got the problem of unholy people, unholy things, holy people, and holy things. And this is where the importance of the Catholic distinctions are so important. Like one of our principles we have, that's kind of a principle of the whole seminary, is that everyone's supposed to memorize. All things are connected in one hierarchy. That is from God all the way down to prime matter, just above nothing, all things. Distinct, but not completely separate. And when we look at the world in which we are, we have to recognize it is only one world, but it has many parts. One is not many, and many is not one. And in the case of Blessed Trinity, you got three persons and one God. Now, when you come to the world, we find there are millions and millions of parts, but there's still only one world. They're all connected together. And now, so this creates some challenges for us, because there's a one aspect and a many aspect to wherever God is. And then you have to factor in evil. Now the devil comes in, and where there's one, he tries to make it many. And where there's many, he tries to make it one. So where God has many, the devil puts one. Where God has one, the devil puts many. So there now life gets complicated, because the devil comes into the picture to destroy the unity and the diversity of the world. For instance, an example of this one many, we have many cultures, many different families, many different backgrounds, many different customs, but only one faith. And so that now, what does the devil do? He says you need to have many faiths, many beliefs, and only one custom. Everybody has to have the same genes with holes in them. Everybody has to follow the same styles, the same rules of styles, and if they don't follow them, they're going to be executed by the people. So where God had many, we have all the girls and men have to dress the same and act the same. So where God had many, the devil makes one. And where God had one, the devil makes many. He's the father of lies. So we have to recognize that there are distinctions to be drawn, but not separation. And here we go into the foundation. We talk about the holiness of the church, is where a lot of people find themselves fall into the error, and it's a grave error, of sedevacantism, which is now spread in the Novus-Ordo church as well. I've now met multiple Novus-Ordo people that are sedevacantists. So now you used to have to go to one of the conditions of being sedevacantist before, believing that there was no pope, is that you had to be, you went to the Latin Mass and you said that the Pope John Paul II is bad, Pope Francis is bad, he can't be the Pope. And the Arab essentially is making the mistake of what is holiness of the church is being applied to the person. So we make here a distinction with the holiness. And Bishop Sheen gives an explanation. In the priest, there are two natures, so to speak. There is the Simon nature and the Peter nature, is the way that Bishop Sheen says it. And every priest, there's a Simon and there's a Peter. Simon equals the natural man. And Peter equals the representative of Christ. These two natures are in the priesthood, and God wanted them to be there. St. Jerome gives a simple reason. St. Jerome says the reason why God put these two natures in a priest, a Simon, weak human nature, and a divine representation of God, Peter nature, The reason why he did that is quite simply because of the great sin of man, which is pride. The sin of man is pride. It was pride that caused Adam and Eve to commit their sin. So pride is the problem. And hence St. Jerome says, well, how do you deal with pride? How do you overcome the problem of pride? This is done by having to listen to a simple man, to be a representative of God. If we can go directly to God, we don't need a human intermediary, then we can say, I know what's right, I went directly to God, I read my Bible, I know what's right, I had a divine inspiration myself, the Holy Spirit, the Holy Ghost inspired me, and I don't need God. I go directly to Him. This builds up the great sin of pride, which is what caused Adam and Eve to fall in the first place. Hence, St. Jerome says, well, God, therefore, made sure, besides it was even before the fall, there was hierarchy in the church, but He made sure that He kept that there would be a priest who was going to have a Simon, weak nature on the one side, and a Peter nature on the other side, and that he's a Simon and a Peter. He's both. This applies to the Pope, of course, but it also applies to all priests and all authorities who are representatives of God. You can even apply it to the normal authority of the head of the business or the company, the father, the head of a family. You can apply it really to any authority, because every authority is a representative of God. And then St. Thomas Aquinas gives us a rule. It's from the Acts chapter 5. Now we're supposed to obey the authority, and the authority represents God. So therefore there's a question. Since we're supposed to obey the authority, Simon Peter, and the authority represents God, should we obey the authority in every single instance? And St. Thomas Aquinas responds, no, because it says in Acts chapter 5, we obey God rather than men. So that when the apostles were asked to not just practice their faith and spread their faith, true faith anymore, they said no. They disobeyed the authorities of Rome, and they were thrown in prison. And they said, why are you doing that? And St. Peter said, we obey God rather than men. So yes, we obey men when they represent God, but we recognize that sometimes men, even though they have authority from God, are going to act as representatives of themselves and not representatives of God. And when they do that, we have to obey God rather than men. When the man represents God and not himself, then we obey him. When he represents himself and not God, we don't obey him. St. Barbara speaks about a distinction. He says that some distinguish between the sedes and the sedentem when he talks about the Pope. Some distinguish between the seat and the one sitting. Because see, one of the problems of sedevacantism, very similar to the error about the sacraments, is that in order to be a Pope, you have to have faith. Well, if personal faith of the Pope was what made our church holy, then that would be true. Because if we depended on the faith of the Pope, then the Pope would need to have faith. However, we don't depend upon the faith of the Pope. Just like the sacraments. If the priest does not believe that Jesus Christ is God, and the priest does not believe in the Blessed Sacrament, he doesn't believe the host is transubstantiated from bread to the body and blood and soul of Christ, but he's told, I'll give you a $10 stipend if you say Mass. Okay, I'll take $10. So he says the Mass, he says the prayers. He doesn't believe anything. But because he's a priest, and because he does what the church does, that man who has no personal faith and is in a state of mortal sin, when he says the words, hoc est enim carpus meum, this is my body, for this is my body, Christ is there, infallibly inside the host. Christ is there. If an atheist does a baptism, Christ is there. If an atheist does an ordination of the priesthood, Christ is there. If a Satanist or a Mason does an ordination of the priesthood, he's there. If he does a baptism or confirmation, any one of the sacraments, he's there. Well, the same is true also with regard to jurisdiction. A man that is a representative of God, this Simon, he's a representative of God. And it was after St. Peter was called Peter that he showed his weakness, because our Lord wanted to make it very clear that the holiness of the church is in God, Comes from him. And his holiness will be in the Pope despite the Pope's wickedness and weakness. It'll be in the priest despite the priest's wickedness and weakness. So this is one side of the consideration, not the complete consideration. So there's a Simon Peter. So we can say that the problem you have is that Simon is not the same as Peter, and Peter is not the same as Simon. However, you can never ever have a Peter by himself. Peter without Simon is impossible. Peter without Simon equals nothing, right? Right now there's no Queen of England, because the Queen of England doesn't rule England. She's just called the Queen. So there's queens in San Francisco and there's a queen in England. Neither of them are queens. They're not queens. They don't have authority. They don't rule the people. They don't make laws. They don't govern armies. They don't rule. They're not queens. She's not a queen in England. The word queen is applied to her, but she is not a queen. She doesn't have any authority. If you check your genealogy, you go to genealogy.com, you'll find out your great-grandpa was King Loser the First. Just go through your genealogy. You're going to find there was some king that's in your genealogy. Our Lord Jesus Christ was the son of David, and Joseph was the son of David. Joseph was not a king. Joseph was the son of David, but he was not a king. He never became a king. He was not born a king. He didn't live a king. He didn't die a king. And the Blessed Virgin Mary was a daughter of David. And she's a queen of heaven. St. Anne, rather, with her mother, she was never a queen. The Blessed Virgin Mary was a queen, but because she's made the queen of heaven. The Blessed St. Anne was not a queen. Joachim was not a king. So to have an ancestry and to train a bloodline doesn't make you a king. You have to have both together. To be a king or to be a priest, you have to be Simon Peter. Both of these things must be together. And here is where we have the great challenge. Simon Peter. Right now there is a Simon Peter in Rome. There are Simon Peters in lesser ways, priests all over the world. There are Simon Peters amongst baptized Catholics, applying the same principle to lay people all over the world. And so that there's a Simon nature and a Peter nature. The Simon nature are weak sinfulness, and the Peter nature, which is a perfect representation of God. But God has willed that this Peter nature be along with the Simon in such a way that you can't go to heaven without a Simon Peter. So friends, every day at the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, we pray for Pope Francis. Now you've got a whole list of new Catholics that they don't pray for Pope Francis anymore. They pray for Pope Benedict or no Pope. And others say that there's no Pope. Some say now there's a whole new branch of sedevacantism. There's new branches of the denials, and all of them point to the same more or less problem, which is this man who is bad, this man who doesn't have the faith, he can't be the head of the church. Well, yes, he can. Because it is whoever, when you get ordained a priest and you become a bishop and you sit in the chair in a diocese, you're the bishop of the diocese. You're the bishop in charge of the diocese. You may not be holy, like Bishop Kurtz, our beloved bishop, may not be holy. He says the new Mass. He promotes Vatican II, which you should not be doing, celebrates the new Mass, which you should not be doing, teaches ecumenism, religious liberty, and so on, follows the errors of the council, the heresies of the council, we should not be doing that. But the thing is, so when we talk about going back to the holiness of the church, here's where it requires faith. That the Simon nature, and here we refer to the weak aspect of it, because there are two sides of the Simon nature. There's the good part and there's the weak part. Consider here only the weak part. The Simon nature is carrying this Peter, Bishop Sheen says it, the Simon nature carrying the Peter power. So he says you've got a Simon nature carrying a Peter power. Is the way he says it with the priesthood. So this Simon nature, God has willed that the Peter power of priesthood, not referring to the papacy, but just to the priesthood, that the Peter power of priesthood can only be carried by Simons. As an example of this, we learn that in order to have a valid baptism, to have a valid confession, it must be a living person in statu viae that baptizes you, or that hears your confession. So if St. John Vianney was to come down and baptize you, you would not be baptized. If St. John Vianney was to come down and hear your confession, it would not be a valid confession, because St. John Vianney is now in eternity. He's in heaven. He's no longer in statu viae. So there's something about the state of a wayfarer and statu viae that's essential to our Catholic faith. There's one consideration about this holiness of the church, that the holiness of the church still resides in priests and bishops and a pope who are personally exceedingly unholy. The holiness of the church still resides in them. Why does God allow that? He allows that in order to test our faith. He does allow that to test our faith. Now, here's an answer, an objection to that made by some people. Well, if he's the priest, and he's the bishop, and he's the pope, he says the new Mass. He teaches the errors and heresies of the council. He's the pope. You're supposed to obey the pope. He's the bishop of the diocese. You're supposed to obey the bishop of the diocese. He wants you to say the new Mass. He wants you to be in the next ecumenical procession that we're going to have next week. He wants those things. Therefore, if you're going to accept him as pope and accept him as bishop, then you've got to obey him. Because no. Because his papacy, here we distinguish between the office and the person. We distinguish between the office and the person. We don't separate the two, we distinguish between them. The office equals the office of bishop, or the office of pope, or the office of priest, whatever the authority is. Now the office, and there's the person, which equals, for instance, on Tista de Nostro, we'll talk here about, just stick with the Pope, the office of Pope. The person, Francis. We're instructed, for instance, always to say the first name, not the last name. We're instructed to say the first name, because the first name signifies the individual person. The last name signifies his tradition, his family background, his connections. But the first name signifies the individual person. Hence we say Francis, our Pope, or Joseph, our Bishop. Joseph Kurtz, the Bishop of Louisville, or whoever the name of the bishop is. We say the first name. So Donald, our duck, our president. So we say that we say the name of the individual person, the first name signifying the person, and then the office is because it's a person who's in that office. And so St. Robert Bellarmine says, as we mentioned earlier, some distinguish between the sedes and the sedentem, the seat and the one sitting. And this is absurd. Because you don't have priesthood unless you've got a priest. You don't have priest unless you got Father Bob. If you got Father Bob, you've got a priest. If you don't have Father anybody, you don't have priest. You can't have priest floating in the air. You can't have pope floating in the air. You can't have king floating in the air. You can't have doctor floating in the air. You can't have man floating in the air. You can have Ralph, Ted, Bob, but you can't have a man. You can't have priest. You can't have bishop. You can't have pope. So there can only be a pope if there is a Francis that's a pope. If there is a Benedict that's a pope. If there is a John Paul that's a pope, a Pius that's a pope, and so on. There has to be a real man who is this pope. And that real man carries a office with him. However, he is not equal to his office. He's not identical to his office. He's not God. God is 100%. The Father is God, 100%. Whereas the Francis is not Pope 100%. He's Pope, but he's also Francis. As Pope, he can't screw up. As Francis, he's got plenty of room for screwing up. And so here's our challenge. As Francis, it's the real man who is Francis. And that real man holds the office of the papacy. How did he get it? It's a real physical, material office. He's elected Pope by the citizens of Rome. Who are the citizens of Rome? They are the cardinals. Cardinals are made honorary citizens of Rome. And when someone goes into a conclave, all the cardinals go into a conclave. What happens is that there is an election. And before the election, there's a declaration that anyone who's excommunicated of these cardinals, no matter what their excommunication is, the second you walk into the conclave, the excommunications are all lifted. They don't exist anymore. And that's the decree of many popes, St. Pius X being one of them to decree that, Pius XII another one to decree that, and Benedict XIV was another one that decreed that, and many other popes decreed that. And so they said that because why did they do that? To make sure that no one could play games and say, oh, you're excommunicated, you're not Pope. They wanted also, in order to make sure that people not play games and do that, there was a law made many centuries ago that whatever is said in the conclave is to be held as the seal of the confessional, and that if any cardinal breaks the proceedings, lets it know the proceedings of the conclave, then he is going to be excommunicated. Why is that? Why do we keep the seal? Because when you go to confession, you don't say all your good things, you say all your sins. And guess what happens in a conclave? They're not holy in a conclave. They're wicked cardinals, wheeler-dealers, politicians, and they make deals, and they are wicked, and they tell lies, and that's how they elect popes. Wicked sinners. Now these men, some of the holy ones, they just make an election. The ones that control things are wicked. Therefore, there's a silence. There's a secret of the conclave. When the man in white comes out, this is the man who's the head of the church. That's it. All the cardinals accept him. That's it. He's the head of the church. Now this man is the head of the church. He's capable of doing many great and wicked things, just like a bishop is or a priest is. And so if the priest or the bishop tells you to do something that is contrary to God, then you're obliged to say no. Just like to any other authority, because of Acts chapter 5, like St. Thomas Aquinas points out in the Summa, in his question on the virtue of obedience, that whenever we're commanded to do something wicked, we have to say no. But we recognize he still is a representative of Christ. We treat him with the respect of his priesthood, and we recognize this real man, Francis, the Bishop of Rome, this real man, Benedict, the former Bishop of Rome, no longer the Bishop of Rome, the real man, John Paul II, and so on. All these real men who were chosen as the Bishop of Rome, we accept their holy office. We recognize the office can't be without the person. It doesn't float in the sky. The office is distinct from the person, but it can't be without the person. You can't have husband, but you can't have this particular man as a husband. And you can't have, and so it is that's why we point out, for instance, that the Blessed Virgin Mary, she's the mother of God. She's not the mother of divinity, but she's not the mother of the human nature. She can only be the mother of a person, and that person is God. She's the mother of the second person of Blessed Trinity made man. She is not the mother of human nature. She is not the mother of divine nature. She can never be the mother of divine nature. She's created by God. But she can't be the mother of human nature. She is not the mother of human nature. She's the mother of a person. And that person is the second person of Blessed Trinity, and therefore she's rightly and truly called the Mother of God, and yet she is not the mother of divinity. So in a similar way, when you have a pope is a person, not a papacy. It's a person. So one of the errors of the study of God is to say that Pope is a kind of a papacy, that papacy is still floating around. Like the heretics that say that the Blessed Virgin Mary is a mother of the human nature. No, that's a heresy. She's not the mother of human nature. She's the mother of a person. And He is God. So likewise, you can't have a papacy. You have to have a person who is a pope. You can't have a priesthood. You have to have a person who is a priest. You can't have a king. You've got to have a person who is a king. You can't have the head of Coca-Cola Company. You have to have a person who's the head of Coca-Cola Company. A person that's running the lemonade stand. You have to have a person that's doing these things. But that person is divided into two parts. He has his own personal characteristics, which are not to do with lemonade stands, not to do with Coca-Cola Company, and not to do with papacy or episcopacy. And then he is also in charge of Coca-Cola Company, or he is in charge of a lemonade stand, or he is in charge of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. And as the head of the church, he has got the Holy Office. So now you got a problem. Here we got a pope like Francis, or other popes before him, who were wicked. And we say, how can he be the pope? How can the church still be holy when you have such a wicked man as pope? I want nothing to do with him. Well, not only do we have nothing to do with him as a person in his individual self, we have nothing to do with any sins of anyone. So when you pray in the canon of the Mass, Cum Papa Nostro Francisco, Cum Auditore Nostro Iosefo, when you pray for our Pope Francis, our local Bishop Joseph, you are praying for them, that real person, in his office of papacy, in his office of episcopacy. And they're praying that his will as Pope and his will as Bishop be accomplished. And what is his will as Pope? The preservation of the faith. What is his will as Bishop? The preservation of the faith. What's his personal will? We hope it matches. If it doesn't, God forgive him. If it does, may God strengthen him. But we don't know what his personal will is. And we're not concerned about that, except we hope that it matches the will of him as Pope, the will of him as Bishop, the will of him as priest. So that when a Pope or a Bishop, they still can carry the holiness of the church, because the office of that holiness is in them personally. It's not floating in the sky. The church is still visible. Even in the days of the persecution of the church, when Pope St. Peter and Pope St. Linus and Pope St. Clement and Pope St. Sixtus, when they ran around in Rome, they were in lay clothes. They were in disguise. And when they said Mass in the catacombs, they said it only a few, so that people would not know which one was them. And yet the Romans knew Sixtus is in charge of the Catholic Church. We know his name. His name is Sixtus. We don't have a description of what he looks like right now, but we know his name. We know he's down in the catacombs, which became the catacombs of St. Sixtus, because that's where he was captured. He was captured in those catacombs. They took on his name. So we know he's down in the catacombs in the graveyards. We know that he's in charge of the church. We heard that he's going to be saying Mass tomorrow. They sent soldiers down, and sure enough, they caught him with St. Lawrence the deacon, St. Sixtus saying the Mass. We caught him. We caught him. We got him. The Romans knew that even though he was in disguise, he was a real man. He was in charge of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. He was hiding in the catacombs. The Catholics knew who their bishop was, and the Bishop of Rome was, and they knew he was a real man. You have now this, like for instance, the Syri theory, and the modern idea of the modern, well, nobody knows who the Pope is, that we're not sure who he is. He's not running anything. When they asked Cardinal Syri, for instance, he said, I'm not the Pope. John Paul II is. I'm not the Pope. John the 23rd is. I'm not the Pope. You know, and so the Paul VI is. And so he said that, and then he died, of course, during the reign of John Paul II. But he said, now, if you're, whoever the real Pope is, he's a real man, a Francis, a Benedict, who carries an office with him that is visible, that we can understand, even if you've got to hunt him down. And that people are connected to that real man in this visible church. So we know that Francis is the head of the church. He lives in Rome. He's in charge of the church. But unfortunately, this Francis, his person, his individual person, is pushing things that are contrary to the will of Christ. But his office is still holy. And as Pope, he still wants to spread the faith. And hence St. Paul, Archbishop Lefebvre said, rather, the only way to be faithful to Paul VI, as Pope, that real man, Montini, as Pope, the only way to be faithful as Pope is to resist completely his new Mass, Pope Paul's new Mass, to resist completely his wicked council, and to resist completely all his false teachings and heresies of Vatican II. And this is the way we're faithful to Montini as Pope. And if we follow Montini's personal will, we will be going against his papacy, going against what he stands for, because the holiness of the church is what he represents, and we know what that holiness is. We know the essence of that holiness, and he's going against it, therefore we have to say no to it. When he acts in a conciliar way, he's blocking grace. When he represents conciliarism, he's blocking the flow of grace. He's going against the divine law. He is bringing death. And he's doing that as a person. He's not doing that by his office. He's using, it appears, the power of his office in order to say, because I'm the Pope, you've got to listen to me. So yes, I listen to you because you're the Pope when you represent Christ. But when you go against Christ, I have to say no. Acts chapter 5, as St. Thomas Aquinas tells us, we obey God rather than men. And hence, the holiness of the church still remains, the holiness of the true church, in the office that is located inside of that person, but is distinct from that person, not separate from that person. Just like the office of anyone else. Distinct from the person, but not separate from the person. There has to be a living human being who carries the church. And God, it is a dogma of our faith that we all must believe as followers of Jesus Christ and members of the true church, that there will be perpetual, living, real human being, male, baptized, episcopal successors of St. Peter until the very ending of the world. They will not all be good, but there will be perpetual successors of St. Peter to the end of the world. There can be small gaps between them. 3 years is the longest gap we've had so far in 2,000 years. But there can't be a whole generation of 20 years gap. There must be perpetual successors of Peter. It's a dogma of our faith. And we say now Francis is a perpetual successor. That's also one of the problems, for instance, the second point, we have to close here, the second point, remember with regard to this whole question of the validity of the new ordination rite, new consecration rite. Pope Francis, Pope Benedict were both consecrated according to the new consecration rite. And if they are not bishops, then they're not the successors of St. Peter, who was the Bishop of Rome. See, being good and being bad is a personal problem. But being a bishop, that's a consecration, that's an ordination. And if they didn't receive that consecration ordination, then we have the problem of the continuation as successor of the apostles. For instance, go back to the canon of the Mass. As St. Thomas points out, this is the chalice of the New Testament that will be shed for you, the priests, the apostles, and many, the lay people. The Pope fits in the you category in the consecration of the Mass, and not in the many category. The bishops fit in the you category and not the many category. And Christ was speaking there at that Last Supper to his bishops, and particularly the Bishop of Rome, St. Peter. And he said, this chalice shall be shed for you, St. Peter, and Andrew, James, John, Thomas, James, all the way down the line, and for many unto the remission of sins. Of course, and so that the you equals the priesthood, and equals the episcopacy, equals the successors of the priests, successors of the bishops. And so this is one of the big theological disastrous problems of, a complete denial of the validity, for instance, of the new ordination rite. Remember, no error is without consequences. Whenever you make an error, it's going to have very many grave consequences. And so the Archbishop Lefebvre always refused to do that. He never said they never would do that. And so we have here that the person in the office must be separated, distinct, but they're inside of the same individual, and that God allows there to be a Simon weak nature connected with the Peter nature, and that our faith is supposed to see through the Simon weakness and see still the divine presence of St. Peter. And also it helps us to be able to fulfill the command of St. Paul, where he says, if an angel from heaven teaches you something different, angel refers to the word specifically of bishops, messengers, then let him be anathema. Let him be condemned. Let him be cursed. Don't follow him. But you don't change what he is. You don't change where he comes from. All you do is you let him be anathema. You don't follow him. You don't obey him. You don't follow him in his sinfulness or in his erroneous or bad teaching. You can't do that. Right? So in any case, the holiness of the church still remains. You've got the Simon nature, Peter nature. They are distinct, but they must both be together. You can never have a Peter power without a Simon nature. You can never have an office of Pope without a person of Francis or a person of Benedict or a person of whoever. There has to be a real person who carries it. This person must be visible. He can't just be an unknown, invisible being. He must be a visible, real being in the church, because our church is a real entity living inside of this world. It is not of the world, as our Lord says, but it's in the world. It's in the world. And then, so we'll better close here. We've only got a few minutes. I guess they're doing the office now. Anybody have any quick questions, and then we'll pack it in? Yes?
I was told that the sacrament, the Eucharist, was not effective if the priest did not believe he was doing that.
Oh, okay. You were told that the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist was not confected if the priest does not believe. Yeah, no, that's an error. The teaching of the church is that the priest who says the words, the form, applies the matter, is infallibly makes Christ present, provided he has the intention to do what the church does. And all that means is, as St. Thomas points out, and St. Pope Leo XIII explains very clearly, that Apostolicae Curae in 1898, that if the priest says the words, "This is my body," and he says it seriously, it's not a joke or a movie or something like that, then infallibly Christ is made present. That's very important in the sacraments, because otherwise we would never have any sure sacraments. Because down the last 2,000 years, for instance, there have been literally thousands of bishops that were complete heretics. For instance, the Arian crisis. There wasn't one Arian that believed that Jesus Christ was God in the Blessed Sacrament. They thought he was just a man. They believed in partial substantiation. They believed that the body and blood of Christ was in the host, but not the divinity, because they didn't believe the divinity. Obviously, when you talk about transubstantiation, the body, blood, and soul and divinity is in the host. But Arians did not believe the divinity was in the host.
So what happens?
When the Arians said Mass, Christ was made present, body, blood, soul, and divinity. The Arians were heretics, and they were public about their heresy. They were public, very public. We do not believe Jesus Christ is God. And yet they said Mass every day. Only the Latin Trinity Mass. There was no such thing as a new Mass. And the Eastern one said the Eastern versions of the Mass. And all their Masses were truly valid. Christ was truly made present, because this is where we talk about, see that Peter aspect? The Peter aspect, it's there despite the Simon. And so as the priest in his Peter power is saying, "This is my body." And St. Augustine explains it on the flip side. He says, let's look at it the positive way. Let's say the priest really loves God, and the priest really believes. Does that make Christ present? Absolutely not. I can really believe. Really, really believe. It's like, whatever that movie was, The Robe or whatever it was, one of those where Simon Magus really believed that he could fly. Remember? He really believed he could fly, and he didn't need the ropes. So he went up to the top of the tower and he said, "I can fly." Didn't work out real well for him. But he really believed all the way until he went splat. So really believing, I can believe all I want. My belief cannot make Christ enter a host. Impossible. My belief cannot take away your sins. And St. Augustine points it out that way. It's Christ's power in me that makes Christ present in the Blessed Sacrament. And since it's Christ's power in me that makes him present to begin with, my belief doesn't make him present. Therefore, that's the argument of St. Thomas Aquinas. My belief does not make him present. Therefore, the absence of my belief does not take him away. So likewise to the Pope. His belief that he's in charge, I mean, ask these athletes today, who's the greatest athlete? How many of them believe they're the greatest? A whole bunch of them. They just don't win any gold medals, and they don't win any games. But they sure believe they're the greatest. So our personal belief doesn't make us the greatest athlete. Our personal belief definitely doesn't make Christ become present. Therefore, the taking away of that belief does not take it away. That's the precise argument of St. Thomas Aquinas in the Tertia Pars, question 60 of the Summa Theologica. That's the precise argument of St. Thomas Aquinas. And so when you look at the holiness of the church as regards sacraments and also as regards jurisdiction, because the jurisdiction is a very similar thing. He's a representative of God, not representative of himself. As representative of God, remember the English, they put the wig on. When you put on the wig, that means that you're not representing you, right? You're representing, some guy with a wig, representing the government, right? And so that's why, for instance, practical reason we put on vestments at Mass. We put on vestments, that means I'm not acting as me. I'm still me, still a human being, but I'm acting as sacerdos as the alter Christus, as another Christ. And but it goes. Anything else there? Okay, this is time. I guess we missed the Holy Office. They finished the Holy Office. So a few minutes now is the dinner or lunch. We'll go ahead and say a prayer and then head over to lunch. In the Father, and Son, and Holy Ghost, amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost. Saint Vincent Ferrer, Saint Jude, Lady of Victory, Lady of Sorrows, Lady of Christians, Saint Ignatius,